Okay, let's go into the second one. Have you still got stamina? Now I know that before we start this next one, I know that this requires quite a paradigm shift and that it is hard to switch from one form of belief to another one just like that. But I'm asking you just to look at the evidence and make an overall assessment. And I'm not telling you that you must change, I'm just saying look at the evidence and see what appears to be catastrophic and whether it makes sense or not. It should get clearer as we go along. Right. We'll just wait for the folks to settle down a little. Right, now we're going to talk fossils. Gott und die Wissenschaft, God and science. The two seem to be at loggerheads all the time. And you'll remember that in the previous lecture we looked at all these layers in the geological column. And the question was, did they appear rapidly? Did they form rapidly or did they form slowly? Now we're going to look at the fossils. You'll remember that we said that each layer has a representative layer of fossils associated with it. So in the bottom they say you have marine primitive organisms, and as you go up you get the more and more complex until you get the highly complex mammals and birds at the top. And the question is whether that is really so or whether that is just a theory. So again, if you go to this layer at the bottom there, the Cambrian, that's the type of creature they say would have existed then. Of course it exists today, so they use it as a model as to what life could have been like in the past. And life forms change as we go up the geological column from one age to the next, as we explained in the lecture on the geology. Eventually you had the giant creatures like the dinosaurs that you see over here, the strange mammals, the mammal-like reptiles, and all those interesting creatures. Now, sedimentary rock in which the fossils occur cannot generally be dated. You cannot date sedimentary rock. So I cannot say this rock is so many millions of years old because of radiometric dating. And in any case, even if you could, there would be a problem with the assumptions associated with radiometric dating. But for example, if you find this particular fossil, this particular mollusk down here, in one rock, and you find it in another rock as well, in a different area, then you can assume that the two rocks are of the same age. So if you find a fossil and you find the same fossil elsewhere, you assume that the two rocks are of the same age. This is called the principle of fossil correlation. Now, this rock over here contains this fossil, therefore it is the same age as this rock which contains the same fossil. How old is the rock? It's as old as the fossil. But how old is the fossil? It's as old as the rock. Alright? Do I know how old the rock is? No. Do I know how old the fossil is? No. There's no way in which I can determine it. But science says they are how old? Millions and millions and millions and millions of years. Now let's have a look at some of the statements. If covered by moist sediment, weathering is prevented, and for these reasons quick burial is perhaps the most important condition favoring fossilization. This comes out of an old historical geology book, and I particularly chose an old one to show that they've known this all along. Science has known this all along. You'll find it in all the new textbooks as well. So you have to bury something rapidly in order for it to form a fossil. And fossilization doesn't take place today as it did in the past. Here you have a fossil stone filled, literally packed with fish. Now what buried them rapidly? If you go to these areas, they will say that these particular fish died in a lake that dried up. What happens today if a lake dries up and there are a lot of fish in the bottom of the lake? They rot, or the birds come and they have a feast, right? But there they fossilized. The only reason why they fossilized is because they were covered, so they couldn't have formed in a dry lake. They must have been rapidly buried. That's the only explanation. We can also say how quickly they were buried. Because a fish rapidly, when it floats in water, loses the head, because the ligament rots and the head falls off. So this one over here has been floating in the water for a couple of days, maybe a week even, but it still has the scales, and they fall off next. So you can see how rapidly something fossilized. Now, if you go through the textbooks, they will show you how these animals supposedly fossilized. There they were. These were apparently roaming around when a volcano erupted and buried them in volcanic ash. And then through erosion they start appearing, and you can find them in the rocks. But that's not what you find in the fossil record. When you look at the fossil record, you'll see that the animals and the plants are washed into position. And that's catastrophism. Look at this one over here. Perfect. It has huge scales and a big bony head. And they say that these animals are extremely primitive, and if they have these big scales, these hard bony scales, they were primitive fish. Interesting thing is that the sturgeon, which makes caviar, has these big plates and lives today. And yet we have to consider it primitive on the grounds that it has big bony scales. Fact of the matter is, there are lots of fish that live today that look exactly the same as these fish that supposedly lived millions of years ago. If you find lots of scales buried in a rock strata, then that would have to happen rapidly, because today you don't find that. Scales dissolve in seawater as they go down to the bottom. You don't find them in the mud at the bottom. So these fish must have been churned and buried very rapidly. Here you have a fish and another little fish. Sometimes you have a fish with a reptile in its mouth, fossilized. How did that happen? Both of them must have been in the water. The fish came, took a bite, and before it could swallow, a turbidite came along and instant fossil. The only way to explain. Look at this one. Absolutely immaculate. And you even find ripple marks around it. So this fish must have been buried instantly. Instantly. Here you have a soft-bodied animal. This is a jellyfish. So there's no problem with soft-bodied animals, because scientists would like to tell you that they don't find soft-bodied animals, and so you don't have a good record of what happened in the past. But we are told that everything started off with simple organisms,